evening, I'm Jason Calvert, and this is the Historytellers. Welcome to part 3 in our series on American life in the 17th century. New Englanders developed a Bible commonwealth, a stern but clear society where the rules of society were dictated by the laws of the Bible. This good versus evil society is best illustrated by the Salem witch trials. Even though the events in Salem are an example of reason being taken to an absolute extreme, most of New England life was rather calm. As a whole, the northern colonies were inhabited by a group of people who grew to be self-reliant and stern, pious and proud, family-oriented and sharp in thought as well as tongue. They were a crusty, steely-eyed, industrious group. Starting our show off tonight is James Marshall, who reports on life in the New England towns.
Sturdy New Englanders evolved a tightly knit society, the basis of which was small villages and farms. This development was natural in a people anchored by geography and hemmed in by the Indians, the French, and the Dutch. Puritanism likewise made for unity of purpose and for concern about the moral health of the whole community. It was no accident that the 19th century crusade for abolishing black slavery, with Massachusetts agitators at the forefront, sprang in some degree from the New England conscience with its Puritan roots. In the Chesapeake region, the expansion of settlement was somewhat random and was usually undertaken by lone wolf planters on their own initiative, but New England society grew in a more orderly fashion. New towns were legally chartered by the colonial authorities, and the distribution of land was entrusted to the steady hands of sober-minded town fathers, or proprietors. After receiving a grant of land from the colonial legislature, the proprietors moved themselves and their families to the designated place and laid out their town. It usually consisted of a meeting house, which served as both the place of worship and the town hall, surrounded by houses. Also marked out was a village green, where the militia could drill. Each family received several parcels of land, including a woodlot for fuel, a tract suitable for growing crops, and another for pasturing animals. Towns of more than 50 families were required to provide elementary education, and a majority of the adults knew how to read and write. As early as 1636, just 8 years after the colony's founding, the Massachusetts Puritans established Harvard College, today the oldest corporation in America, to train local boys for the ministry. Only in 1693, 86 years after staking out Jamestown, did the Virginians establish their first college, William and Mary. Puritans ran their own churches, and democracy in congregational church government led logically to democracy in political government. The town meeting, in which the adult males met together and each man voted, was a showcase and a classroom for democracy. New England villagers from the outset gathered regularly in their meeting houses to elect their officials, appoint schoolmasters, and discuss such mundane matters as road repairs. The town meeting, observed Thomas Jefferson, was the best school of political liberty the world ever saw. For the Historytellers, I'm James Marshall.
Worries plagued the God-fearing pioneers of these tidy New England settlements. The pressure of a growing population was gradually dispersing the Puritans onto outlying farms, far from the control of church and neighbors. And although the core of Puritan belief still burned brightly, the passage of time was dampening the first generation's flaming religious zeal. About the middle of the 17th century, a new form of sermon began to be heard from Puritan pulpits, the Jeremiad. Taking their cue from the doomsaying Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, earnest preachers scolded parishioners for their waning piety. Especially alarming was the apparent decline in conversions, testimonials by individuals that they had received God's grace and therefore deserved to be admitted to the church as members of the elect. Troubled ministers in 1662 announced a new formula for church membership, the halfway covenant. This new arrangement modified the covenant, or the agreement between the church and its adherents, to admit to baptism, but not full communion, the unconverted children of existing members. By conferring partial membership rights in the once exclusive Puritan congregations, the halfway covenant weakened the distinction between the elect and others, further diluting the spiritual purity of the original settlers' godly community. The halfway covenant dramatized the difficulty of maintaining at fever pitch the religious devotion of the founding generation. Jeremiads continued to thunder from the pulpits, but as time went on, the doors of the Puritan churches swung fully open to all comers, whether converted or not. This widening of church membership gradually erased the distinction between the elect and other members of society. In effect, strict religious purity was sacrificed somewhat to the cause of wider religious participation. Interestingly, from about this time onward, women were in the majority in the Puritan congregations. Women also played a prominent role in one of New England's most frightening religious episodes. A group of adolescent girls in Salem, Massachusetts, claimed to have been bewitched by certain older women. A hysterical witch hunt ensued, leading to the legal lynching in 1692 of 20 individuals, 19 of whom were hanged and one of whom was pressed to death. 2 dogs were also hanged. Larger-scale witchcraft persecutions were then common in Europe, and several outbreaks had already flared forth in the colonies, often directed at property-owning women. But the reign of horror in Salem grew not only from the superstitions and prejudices of the age but also from the unsettled social and religious conditions of the rapidly evolving Massachusetts village. Most of the accused witches came from families associated with Salem's burgeoning market economy. Their accusers came largely from subsistence farming families in Salem's hinterland. The episode thus reflected the widening social stratification of New England, as well as the fear of many religious traditionalists that the Puritan heritage was being eclipsed by Yankee commercialism. The witchcraft hysteria eventually ended in 1693 when the governor, alarmed by an accusation against his own wife and supported by the more responsible members of the clergy, prohibited any further trials and pardoned those already convicted. 20 years later, a penitent Massachusetts legislature annulled the convictions of the witches and made reparations to their heirs. The Salem witchcraft delusion marked an all-time high in the American experience of popular passions run wild. Witch hunting passed into the American vocabulary as a metaphor for the often dangerously irrational urge to find a scapegoat for social resentments. The New England way of life shaped how the people adapted to and profited from the land they settled on. Reporting tonight about the rocks and soil of New England, is Elise Marie.
Oddly enough, the story of New England was largely written by rocks. The heavily glaciated soil was strewn with countless stones, many of which were forced to the surface after a winter freeze. In a sense, the Puritans did not possess the soil, it possessed them, by shaping their character. Scratching a living from the protesting earth was an early American success story. Backbending toil put a premium on industry and penny-pinching frugality, for which New Englanders became famous. Traditionally sharp Yankee traders, some of them palming off wooden nutmegs, made their mark. Connecticut came in time to be called good-humoredly the Nutmeg State. Cynics exaggerated when they said that the 3 stages of progress in New England were to get on, to get honor, to get honest. The grudging land also left colonial New England less ethnically mixed than its southern neighbors. European immigrants were not attracted in great numbers to a site where the soil was so stony, and the sermons so sulfurous. Climate likewise molded New England, where the summers were often uncomfortably hot and the winters cruelly cold. Many early immigrants complained of the region's extremes of weather. Yet the soil and climate of New England eventually encouraged a diversified agriculture and industry. Staple products like tobacco did not flourish, as in the South. Black slavery, although attempted, could not exist profitably on small farms, especially where the surest crop was stones. No broad, fertile expanses comparable to those in the tidewater South beckoned people inland. The mountains ran fairly close to the shore, and the rivers were generally short and rapid. And just as the land shaped New Englanders, so they shaped the land. The Native Americans had left an early imprint on the New England earth. They traditionally beat trails through the woods as they migrated seasonally for hunting and fishing. They periodically burned the woodlands to restore leafy first-growth forests that would sustain the deer population. The Indians recognized the right to use the land, but the concept of exclusive, individual ownership of the land was alien to them. The English settlers had a different philosophy. They condemned the Indians for wasting the earth by underutilizing its bounty and used this logic to justify their own expropriation of the land from the native inhabitants. Consistent with this outlook, the Europeans felt a virtual duty to improve the land by clearing woodlands for pasturage and tillage, building roads and fences, and laying out permanent settlements. Some of the greatest changes resulted from the introduction of livestock. The English brought pigs, horses, sheep, and cattle from Europe to the settlements. Because the growing herds needed ever more pastureland, the colonists were continually clearing forests. The animals' voracious appetites and heavy hooves compacted the soil, speeding erosion and flooding. In some cases, the combined effect of these developments actually may have changed local climates and made some areas even more susceptible to extremes of heat and cold. Repelled by the rocks, the hardy New Englanders turned instinctively to their fine natural harbors. Hacking timber from their dense forests, they became experts in shipbuilding and commerce. They also ceaselessly exploited the self-perpetuating codfish off the coast of Newfoundland, the fishy gold mines of New England, which have yielded more wealth than all the treasure chests of the Aztecs. During colonial days, the wayfarer seldom got far from the sound of the axe and hammer, or the swift rush of the ship down the ways to the sea, or the smell of rotting fish. As a reminder of the importance of fishing, a handsome replica of the sacred cod is proudly displayed to this day in the Massachusetts State House in Boston. The combination of Calvinism, soil, and climate in New England made for energy, purposefulness, sternness, stubbornness, self-reliance, and resourcefulness. Righteous New Englanders prided themselves on being God's chosen people. They long boasted that Boston was the hub of the universe, at least in spirit. A famous jingle of later days ran, "I come from the city of Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Cabots speak only to Lowells, and the Lowells speak only to God." New England has had an incalculable impact on the rest of the nation. Ousted by their sterile soil, thousands of New Englanders scattered from Ohio to Oregon and even Hawaii. They sprinkled the land with new communities modeled on the orderly New England town, with its central green and tidy schoolhouse, and its simple town meeting democracy. Yankee ingenuity, originally fostered by the flinty fields and comfortless climate of New England, came to be claimed by all Americans as a proud national trait. And the fabled New England conscience, born of the steadfast Puritan heritage, left a legacy of high idealism in the national character and inspired many later reformers. For the Historytellers, I'm Elise Marie.
The cycles of the seasons and the sun set the schedules of all the earliest American colonists, men as well as women, blacks as well as whites. The overwhelming majority of colonists were farmers. They planted in the spring, tended their crops in the summer, harvested in the fall, and prepared in the winter to begin the cycle anew. They usually rose at dawn and went to bed at dusk. Chores might be performed after nightfall only if they were worth the candle, a phrase that has persisted in American speech. Women, slave or free, on southern plantations or northern farms, wove, cooked, cleaned, and cared for children. Men cleared land, fenced, planted, and cropped it, cut firewood, and butchered livestock as needed. Children helped with all these tasks, while picking up such schooling as they could. Life was humble but comfortable by contemporary standards. Compared to most 17th century Europeans, Americans lived in affluent abundance. Land was relatively cheap, though somewhat less available in the planter-dominated South than elsewhere. In the northern and middle colonies, an acre of virgin soil cost about what American carpenters could earn in one day as wages, which were roughly 3 times those of their English counterparts. Dukes don't emigrate, the saying goes, for if people enjoy wealth and security, they are not likely to risk exposing their lives in the wilderness. Similarly, the very poorest members of a society may not possess even the modest means needed to pull up stakes and seek a fresh start in life. Accordingly, most white migrants to early colonial America came neither from the aristocracy nor from the dregs of European society, with the partial exception of the impoverished indentured servants. Grid frontier life did not in any case permit the flagrant display of class distinctions, and 17th century society in all the colonies had a certain simple sameness to it, especially in the more egalitarian New England and middle colonies. Yet many settlers, who considered themselves to be of the better sort, tried to recreate on a modified scale the social structure they had known in the Old World. To some extent they succeeded, though yeasty democratic forces frustrated their full triumph. Resentment against upper-class pretensions helped to spark outbursts like Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 in Virginia and the uprising of Maryland's Protestants toward the end of the 17th century. In New York, animosity between lordly landholders and aspiring merchants fueled Leisler's Rebellion, an ill-starred and bloody insurgence that rocked New York City from 1689 to 1691. For their part, would-be American blue bloods resented the pretensions of the meaner sort and passed laws to try to keep them in their place. Massachusetts in 1651 prohibited poorer folk from wearing gold or silver lace, and in 18th century Virginia a tailor was fined and jailed for arranging to race his horse, a sport only for gentlemen. But these efforts to reproduce the finely stratified societies of Europe proved feeble in the early American wilderness, where equality and democracy found fertile soil, at least for white people. This concludes our 3-part series on American life in the 17th century. Thank you for watching. Our next series reports on the conditions in the colonies that set the stage for a revolution. Remember, history is not a lecture to be heard, but a story to be told. For the Historytellers, I'm Jason Calvert. Good night.